Bonjour à tous. Nous sommes maintenant à Dubaï pour le point de presse de l'arrivée de Monsieur Steven Guilbeault, ministre de l'Environnement et du Changement climatique Canada. We are now in Dubai for the media availability of Minister Guilbeault, Environment and Climate Change. Some housekeeping before we start. Minister Guilbeault will deliver his remarks bilingually, and then we'll go for question period. Since this is a Zoom, please make sure that your name on your Zoom, identify your name, full name and media, just to make sure that we have all grounds covered when you raise your hand for question period. S'il vous plaît, vous assurez que votre nom complet et médias sont dans votre nom et que ce soit facilement identifiable pour que lorsque vous levez la main pour une question, on puisse vous identifier. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Guilbeault. C'est à vous.
Merci beaucoup, Gabi. Good afternoon. Bonjour, tout le monde. COP28 is just getting started here in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And we're already seeing encouraging signs. Depuis ma participation à la toute première COP sur le climat à Berlin en 1995, je peux vous dire que l'action climatique mondiale a incroyablement avancé. En 2023, les incendies de forêt ont forcé des dizaines de milliers de Canadiennes et Canadiens à évacuer leurs demeures et plusieurs grandes villes nord-américaines ont été couvertes de fumée. Des inondations, des cyclones, des ouragans, des incendies. Y a-t-il une seule région du monde qui a échappé aux effets des changements climatiques cette année? Les Nations unies ont déclaré que 2023 a été l'année la plus chaude jamais enregistrée. Le bilan mondial des signataires de l'accord de Paris, qui a lieu tous les 5 ans, tombe à un moment très important. Il nous force à voir que nous ne sommes pas en voie de limiter le réchauffement à 1,5 degrés Celsius et que nous devons corriger le tir. Le Canada est prêt pour la COP28. Nous avons le plan climatique le plus complet de l'histoire de notre pays. Et nous sommes prêts à agir en partenaire constructif. Nous avons des solutions qui fonctionnent pour réduire les émissions. Le défi est de mettre ces solutions en œuvre à grande échelle rapidement. Nous comptons encourager tous les pays à respecter leurs engagements, à financer l'action climatique dans les pays les plus vulnérables. And we are happy to be joined by a large group of provincial, territorial, and Indigenous representatives who are all part of the Canadian delegation, as well as a wide representation from civil society, trade unions, youth, and businesses. While here, I will also be fulfilling a special role at the request of the COP presidency as co-facilitators for the means of implementation of COP28. I am joined by my co-facilitator, Minister Fouad from Egypt. We played a similar role last year when we landed an historic agreement on the protection of nature in Montreal at COP15. Earlier in November, the OECD announced that contributing countries likely met the $100 billion goal last year. This is a good sign, and yet we need to do more. It shows that by working together, we can achieve great things. So we will use COP28 to push further on climate finance. I am glad to see the global community has already come together with the announcement of a new fund to address loss and damages due to climate change experienced by developing countries, who are the least responsible for fueling the climate crisis. This is something Canada fought hard to establish last year at COP27. So I'm happy to announce that Canada is providing $16 million in seed money to the startup costs of this fund for loss and damage. And I want to congratulate the COP28 presidency for their leadership in securing the adoption of the fund on the first day of COP28 and for making a contribution right away. It is good to see others step up with early contributions, and we hope many others will join. Je suis heureux d'annoncer que le Canada fera une contribution de 16 millions de dollars pour le démarrage d'un nouveau fonds qui va aider les pays en voie de développement à compenser les pertes et dommages causés par les changements climatiques. Et je tiens à féliciter la présidence de la COP28 pour leur leadership qui a rendu possible l'adoption du fonds dès le premier jour de la COP28 et pour avoir fait une contribution dès le départ. Nous espérons que plusieurs autres pays suivront l'exemple. Here, the outcomes of these negotiations can shape our future. So we need to walk the talk and take decisions that support course correction and help keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. Canada will be eliminating fossil fuel subsidies by the end of 2023. We are building a net zero grid. We are supporting the global target to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030. We will be endorsing the Global Renewables Energy Efficiency Pledge here in a few days. And we will be calling on other world leaders to join us in delivering the energy transition that we need to fight climate change. En tant que coprésident de l'Alliance énergisée au-delà du charbon, nous allons travailler pour arriver à éliminer l'électricité au charbon une fois pour toutes, partout dans le monde, tout comme le Canada est en voie de le faire. Et nous sommes en voie de réduire nos émissions de méthane de plus de 35% par rapport au niveau de 2020 d'ici 2030. Mais notre ambition ne s'arrête pas là. Nous visons la quasi-élimination du méthane à plus long terme, notamment dans le secteur du pétrole et du gaz, et nous voulons voir des progrès en ce sens à l'échelle globale, ici, à la COP28. At COP28, we will continue what we started at UNGA to boost participation in Canada's global carbon pricing challenge. Canada is calling on all countries to adopt carbon pricing, and we're not alone in doing that. The European Union, Spain, the World Bank, the WTO, the IMF are some of many organizations that are calling us to do this, which is one of the most efficient measures to cut emissions at lower costs and spur innovation. Just a couple of days ago, the European Union joined the challenge. There are now around 75 systems worldwide to put a price on pollution, covering around 25% of global emissions. This is great progress, and we're confident that we can make more progress here at COP28. Un programme chargé nous attend. Nous cherchons à obtenir un résultat fort sur la nature et renforcer l'intégration, l'action en faveur du climat et de la biodiversité. Pour résumer, la COP28 vise à renforcer les solutions dont nous disposons déjà pour réduire les émissions et à construire un avenir favorable à la nature. Il nous incombe à nous toutes et tous ici de montrer au monde que les progrès sont possibles maintenant. Thank you. I would now be happy to answer your questions. Et maintenant, au plaisir de répondre à vos questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le ministre. La première question va être de Mia Robson, Canadian Press. Mia, all yours.
There we go. Sorry, now I'm unmuted. Good morning, or I guess good evening for you, Minister. One of the big things that they seem to be wanting to negotiate at this COP is a phase out of fossil fuels. I know that was something you couldn't achieve at the G20 meeting in the summertime. What's Canada's position on that, and how likely do you think it is to have that kind of language in this year's agreement?
Thank you for the question, Mia. I have said publicly that Canada is very comfortable with language around the phasing out of unabated fossil fuels, which is another way of saying that we want to be carbon neutral by 2050. That's because we know we will still be using, at least according to the IPCC and the International Energy Agency, we will still be using fossil fuels in a carbon neutral world in 2050. We'll be using far less fossil fuels than we are now, but those that we will still be using by then will have to be captured and sequestered. So whether it's carbon neutral, whether it's phasing out of unabated fossil fuels, we're comfortable. It's a conversation we have started last year in Egypt. I think we ran out of time in Egypt to do it. I'm hopeful that we have enough time to do it here, and it's something that Canada has been talking with many countries around the world in the past few months.
When it came to the coal phase out or coal discussion at COP, I believe, only were able to get a phase down of coal, not a phase out of coal. Do you think that that's going to be a sticking point? The idea that it's not about getting rid of it, even if it's unabated, but that sort of lowering the use of it?
Well, we believe that we can eliminate coal from electricity generation in the coming decade or so. It could be 2030. It could be a little bit before that. Certainly, all developed nations are being asked to be out of coal by 2030, and the rest of the world by 2040. I think we will get there faster because of the rate at which renewables are being deployed around the world, and also the cost of renewables, which is now cheaper than coal or even natural gas. We can produce wind energy and solar energy in Canada for cheaper than we can produce natural gas generated electricity. And what is true of Canada is true of most places in the world. So, I mean, and coal, in fact, is declining everywhere in the world. with a notable exception. China, India has also announced recently that they wanted to be building more coal. So by and large, in the world, it is declining, but there are still some areas where we need to work with these governments to find solutions. And in fact, when I was in China this summer, that was part of our conversation with the Chinese government in terms of how can we work together to help China reduce its dependency on coal.
Merci beaucoup. La prochaine question est pour Valérie Gamache de Radio-Canada. Valérie, c'est à vous.
Bonjour, M. Guilbeault. J'aimerais vous entendre sur le montant de 16 millions. On a l'impression que c'est un montant qui est bien peu élevé quand on regarde ce que l'Allemagne offre ce matin, le 100 millions. Est-ce que le Canada aurait pu être plus ambitieux?
En fait, il faut relativiser par rapport à la taille de l'économie et de la population, mais les États-Unis d'Amérique ont également fait un investissement de 16 millions dans ce fonds-là, et les États-Unis, ça demeure la plus grande économie et une population 10 fois plus grande que le Canada. Alors, je pense que quand on se compare proportionnellement à la plupart de nos partenaires, le Canada est dans une position tout à fait correcte et même, je dirais, enviable par rapport à certains.
Et puis, concernant le plafonnement des émissions du secteur pétrolier, est-ce que ce sera enfin l'occasion à la COP de faire une annonce du côté du Canada?
Comme vous vous rappelez peut-être, lors du sommet des Nations unies à New York, le premier ministre avait annoncé que le cadre pour ce règlement-là serait présenté d'ici la fin de l'année. Or, on est on est le 1er décembre aujourd'hui, donc la fin de l'année arrive. Et ce que j'ai dit, c'est que ce sera fait dans un avenir très, très proche.
Merci.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Next question will be Davis Legree. Davis, all yours.
Thanks very much. Hi, Minister. You may have just touched on this in French, but I was hoping you could walk me through the announcement to contribute $16 million to the Loss and Damages Fund. Where's that money coming from? I saw the UAE and Germany are both kicking in $100 million. So just wondering how we arrived at that 16 million number.
So the money is coming out of our international finance contribution to support the developing world in their fight against climate change, both in terms of, those funds are used for a number of different things, including nature-based solutions, including helping countries transition in the global south, transition out of coal, and now this first contribution of $16 million to the Loss and Damage Fund. Yes, Germany made a $100 million commitment yesterday. The United States made a contribution of $16 million. So we feel that it's a good start. The fund is now adopted and will be in the coming months operational. But people should remember that loss and damage is about much more than funding. And the agreement in Egypt was the creation of a fund, definitely for loss and damage, but it's about looking at a number of other tools that are available internationally, often under the UN system, like early warning systems to help populations, and especially vulnerable populations, to be warned when a catastrophe is coming. It's about emergency response, so that when something does happen, we can respond, and those countries have the resources available quickly to respond to emergency. It's about access to capital when they need to rebuild or reconstruct after a catastrophe has hit. So it's about money, but it's about a range of different things.
Gotcha. And I was just hoping you could clear up some of my confusion. Can you help me understand the difference between the money that's going into this new Loss and Damages Fund and the $100 billion milestone that we were celebrating a couple of weeks ago that's also going to help the Global South fight climate change every year? Is this new fund part of that 100 million target? Can you just kind of help me distinguish those two climate finance initiatives?
So the $100 billion goal was set in Copenhagen in 2009, and it wasn't very specific at the time, but the commitment was by developed nations to provide the Global South with $100 billion a year by 2020 to help fight climate change. Could be for mitigation, could be for adaptation. Loss and damage wasn't really part of the conversation I mean, we were talking a little bit about loss and damage, but certainly not in the context of the $100 billion. You can think of it of the $100 billion as a show of good faith by the developed world towards developing countries, in showing that we recognize that we have used a larger portion of our climate budget over many decades, and that is in part creating climate change in those countries, and in many instances in countries that have contributed very little to the problem. So the $100 billion fund is used for different things under the UNFCCC.
Merci beaucoup. La prochaine question, Raymond Filion de TVA. C'est à vous.
Merci. Bonjour, Monsieur le ministre. Vous avez souligné que l'objectif de limiter le réchauffement à 1,5 degré n'est pas en voie d'être atteint. Selon ce que vous voyez, selon ce que vous entendez de la communauté internationale, diriez-vous qu'il y a vraiment une volonté réelle d'y arriver, ou ça demeure un vœu pieux?
C'est important pour voir où on s'en va, c'est important de comprendre d'où on arrive. Et l'un des exercices qu'on a fait et qui va se poursuivre dans les 2 prochaines semaines, c'est le bilan de nos actions collectives depuis la signature de l'accord de Paris en 2015. Et il faut se rappeler qu'avant l'accord de Paris, le monde se dirigeait en 2100 vers un réchauffement d'autour de 4 degrés Celsius. Et là, dans le document pour les discussions sur le bilan qui a été rendu public il y a de ça quelques semaines, on voit que selon les analyses de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie et du GIEC, on se dirige vers un monde où les températures seraient un peu au-dessus de 2 degrés Celsius. Alors, 2 degrés Celsius, c'est encore au-dessus de 1,5, mais c'est beaucoup moins que le 4 degrés Celsius vers lequel on se dirigeait. Or, pour chaque degré Celsius de réchauffement en moins, c'est des milliards de tonnes de pollution qui ne se retrouveront jamais dans l'atmosphère. Donc, nous avons fait des progrès importants depuis la signature de l'accord de Paris, mais il reste encore du travail à faire. Et ce que la communauté scientifique internationale nous dit, c'est que la fenêtre d'opportunité pour tenter de faire en sorte que les températures n'augmentent pas de plus d'1,5 degré Celsius, cette fenêtre-là, elle est de plus en plus, elle se referme sur nous. Alors, il faut accélérer le pas si on veut arriver à faire ça. Et moi, je vous dirais qu'il y a encore un sentiment de détermination chez de nombreux pays, tant au nord qu'au sud, pour tenter d'atteindre cet objectif-là, de limiter le réchauffement à 1,5 degré Celsius.
Le fait que la conférence est présidée par un leader de l'industrie pétrolière, ça fait beaucoup jaser. Est-ce que, selon vous, ça risque de nuire au sommet, de lui enlever de la crédibilité?
D'une part, il faut quand même se rappeler qu'il est aussi le président de la compagnie d'investissement des Émirats arabes unis dans les technologies propres, qui est maintenant l'un des très grands fonds au niveau mondial. C'est un fonds de près de 60 milliards de dollars qui n'investit que dans les technologies propres. Alors, c'est un pays, les Émirats arabes unis, qui est en transition, comme nous le sommes au Canada, comme plusieurs pays le sont, mais et je pense qu'on peut pas fermer les yeux sur le fait qu'encore aujourd'hui, près des 3/4 de notre portefeuille énergétique mondial est basé sur les combustibles fossiles. Alors, je pense que, évidemment, comme président de la COP et comme grand pays producteur de pétrole et de gaz, comme nous le sommes au Canada, je pense que ça ajoute une responsabilité supplémentaire. Et peut-être, qui sait, que le fait que ce soit un pays producteur de pétrole, on pourra faire des choses ici que d'autres n'auraient peut-être pas osé faire dans le cadre de ces négociations-là. On verra.
Thank you. Next question will be Laura Kane from Bloomberg. Laura?
Muted. Hi, thank you so much for taking our questions. So the Alberta and Saskatchewan governments have flatly refused to impose 2 of your key climate policies, the clean electricity regulations and the carbon price, respectively. So you are prepared to release your oil and gas emissions cap soon. How will that policy be drafted in a way to ensure that it will be enforced?
Thank you for the question. First, it's important to understand that just last year in 2022, we tightened carbon pricing, and we had to renegotiate with all provinces carbon pricing in Canada, a more stringent carbon pricing mechanism. And we did so with Saskatchewan, which was negotiated with the government. We negotiated that with Alberta, as well as with all of the other provinces, except for those who already were meeting the federal benchmark equivalency. And carbon pricing is a fact in Canada, and it's happening, despite what some might like to say, what some might do. As for the clean electricity regulation, those regulations aren't even in force yet. We're still at the state. We've presented the draft regulations. We're still at the state of having conversations and consultations with provinces, territories, Indigenous nations, and various stakeholders. We probably won't have final regulations before end of the spring, beginning of the summer. And remember that those regulations don't enter into force for another 12 years or before 2035. And we have a number of provinces that are still very dependent on fossil fuels that have agreed to work with us, namely New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, to work with us on clean electricity. And I think that in the coming months, you will see more provinces come on board. And I mean, it's going to be the law, the federal law. Provinces can't simply decide to ignore federal laws in our federation.
And so as for the oil and gas emissions cap, I mean, how are you going to ensure that that will be enforced? And further, I wonder if you could illuminate us a bit on what's been going on behind the scenes with that. I mean, it is a 2-year-old promise. You've told news outlets in the past that it's coming before certain dates, and then those dates come and go. So what's been happening behind the scenes? Is it industry pushback? What has that pushback entailed? And do you think your final framework is one that will be accepted by the oil and gas industry?
So, I mean, in the past, I have said that I wished that we would be able to present a framework earlier than we are now. But as the Prime Minister has said, it will be coming before the end of the year. And it's not to say that we've done nothing regarding the oil and gas sector. I mean, I was talking about carbon pricing, methane regulations. We already have regulations to reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas sector by at least 40% by 2025. And the Prime Minister has announced that we will present new regulations by the end of this year to reduce those emissions, those methane emissions in the oil and gas sector by at least 75% by 2030, which is one of the most ambitious targets in the world. We've adopted clean fuel standards. So we've done a number of things to tackle the emissions from the oil and gas sector, but unfortunately, that's not enough. It's not enough to ensure that the sector, the workers, the communities have a future in a world that is decarbonizing and where the oil that will be used in the coming decades will, as I was saying earlier, we will have to capture and sequester the emissions from this oil to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. I mean, I won't. It is true that the Supreme Court decision on impact assessment and the federal court ruling on plastics, where we're being told by our tribunals that the federal government can certainly intervene when it comes to matters of pollution, and including climate pollution, but that we have to be very careful not to impede on provincial jurisdictions, has meant that we have to make sure that our regulation does exactly that it tackles pollution without infringing on provincial jurisdiction. And that has meant that it has taken a little bit more time than maybe we had initially anticipated.
Thank you, Minister. We have time for one more question. David Turton from CBC. David, all yours.
Hi, Minister. Thanks so much. I mean, you're going to also be announcing methane regs by the end of this year, draft regs, I believe. How do you see that working with the cap? Like, we've seen some analysis that shows that like strong, deep methane regs could achieve 1/3 of the work that's needed to get to 110 megatons. How do you see that? Do you see it that way too?
I have seen that same analysis, and we will be presenting our own. But you're right that tackling methane is a very good way of tackling the emissions of the oil and gas sector. And in fact, collectively, globally, if we are ambitious in our efforts to tackle methane emissions, we could shave off almost 1 degree Celsius of potential warming by 2100. That's massive. We have the technology to do that, and there is a real global push to do that, and we're working with many of our allies. Certainly, the United States. You might have seen as part of the China-U.S. agreement that was announced a few weeks ago that they have agreed to work on together on methane emissions. So it's important for the world, and it's certainly important for Canada. And yes, reducing methane will be a big part of tackling the oil and gas sector's greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, and just as a follow-up, can I just ask, that framework we're expecting, can you say that, like, people are expecting that there will be a clear outline of this many megatons is how much the sector could emit, and also the type of mechanism that you'll be using to enforce that cap, such as a cap and trade or enhancing carbon pricing. So can you tell us that framework will have, here's the specific megatons that the sector will be able to emit by 2030 and in the future, and also that this is the mechanism the government is proposing to use?
The framework will provide all of the necessary information for people to understand what kind of mechanism we're using, the range in terms of emission reduction for the sector, mechanisms by which they can achieve that. So all of the necessary information to understand, basically the framework, and we did that for the clean electricity regulation. The framework is sort of the regulation, but in plain language. And then the draft regulations will follow suit in the coming months. So you will have all the information you need to be able to make an assessment of what we're trying to achieve.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. That's all the time we had today. Just note that we will be doing more of these media availabilities throughout our time here at COP. À noter que nous allons faire plusieurs de ces disponibilités médias pendant notre temps ici à Dubaï à la COP. Donc, on se voit bientôt. We'll see you very soon.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, everyone.